The fluorescent lights of Michael's hospital hummed their endless, monotonous song as Sarah Mitchell sat hunched over the nurse's station during another exhausting night shift. Her scrubs were wrinkled, coffee stains decorated the sleeve, and her hair, usually kept neatly in a bun, had fallen loose around her face hours ago. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the emergency room was mercifully quiet, though Sarah knew this peace was temporary. The worst usually came after midnight, when drunk drivers, domestic disputes, and accidental overdoses flooded the waiting room. She glanced at the small photo pinned to her bulletin board, her daughter Emma at age 2, before everything fell apart before the silence. 3-year-old Emma sat in the corner of the break room, coloring with crayons that Sarah had brought from home. The child worked methodically, pressing the blue crayon hard against the paper, creating jagged, aggressive marks across a simple picture of the sky. Blue sky, but not peaceful blue, turbulent, violent blue. Sarah had learned to read the messages in Emma's art, the way a therapist might interpret dreams. Each drawing told a story her daughter couldn't speak aloud. Doctor, the child psychologist who had been working with Emma for the past 8 months, called it selective mutism, a condition where psychological trauma essentially locks a child's ability to speak, even though the physical capability remains intact. Emma could speak. She simply wouldn't, or couldn't. The distinction had become increasingly unclear to Sarah. The silence had begun 18 months ago, on a night Sarah tried desperately to forget. She had been working a double shift, and Emma's father, her ex-boyfriend, the man Sarah had thought she could build a life with, had been left alone with their daughter. When Sarah came home that morning, Emma was huddled in her crib, shaking, her eyes wide and unseeing. Was gone, having left nothing but a note saying he wasn't cut out for this. The bruise on Emma's arm, tiny fingerprints of violence on her delicate toddler skin, told Sarah everything she needed to know. The police had been called. Social services had opened a file, but Emma had opened something else entirely. A vault of trauma that had slammed shut, locking away her voice. Since that night, Emma had spoken barely a dozen words, and those were whispered so quietly they seemed accidental. She didn't cry out when she fell. She didn't laugh at cartoons or silly jokes. She didn't call out mommy when Sarah came home from work. The child communicated through an elaborate system of nods and shakes, pointing and gestures, facial expressions and body language. It was as if Emma had decided that words were dangerous, that sound itself was a threat. Her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had sent home notes expressing concern. Emma participated in group activities but did not verbally engage. She watches the other children play but does not attempt to join conversations. Translation: Emma was profoundly isolated, even in the presence of other kids. Sarah watched her daughter now, seeing the tension in those small shoulders, the way Emma's jaw clenched as she colored. The child would flinch at sudden noises, the beep of the microwave, the ring of Sarah's phone, even the gentle chime of the elevator. Last week, during a thunderstorm, Emma had hidden under the bed, shaking uncontrollably for 3 hours. When Sarah finally coaxed her out, the child had wrapped herself around her mother like a baby monkey, refusing to let go for the entire night. These were the moments that broke Sarah's heart into pieces she couldn't reassemble. This was her daughter, her baby, reduced to a frightened shell of what she should be. The hospital's child psychologist doctor had been remarkably patient and kind. She explained that Emma's selective mutism wasn't stubbornness or behavioral, it was a genuine trauma response. The child's brain had essentially shut down her speech as a survival mechanism. In Emma's mind, speaking meant danger. Speaking had preceded the violence. Speaking might bring more pain, so Emma had chosen silence as her shield. Doctor recommended continued therapy, possibly medication, and creating a safe environment where Emma could heal at her own pace. Some children take months to recover their voice, Doctor had said gently. Some take years, but with patience and love, most do eventually speak again. Years. The word haunted Sarah. She was a single mother working 2 jobs to afford the therapy, the medical bills. Her own family had been unsupportive. Her mother blamed Sarah for choosing the wrong man, as if predicting abuse was simply a matter of better judgment. Her father had suggested Emma just needed to toughen up. These well-meaning but deeply unhelpful responses had driven Sarah away from her family entirely. Now it was just her and Emma, a small unit against the world, carrying wounds that no one else seemed to understand. The hardest part was seeing Emma's eyes. They held an ancient sadness, a knowledge of pain that no 3-year-old should possess. Other children her age were learning nursery rhymes and making friends at. Emma was learning how to survive, how to read danger in a raised voice, how to make herself small to avoid being noticed. She had lost her innocence to one night of violence, and Sarah hadn't been there to protect her. That guilt ate at Sarah every single day, gnawing at her from the inside, making her question whether she was failing her daughter by not being able to fix this faster. Sarah's supervisor approached with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you need this," said kindly, setting a steaming cup beside Sarah's keyboard. Had become something of a lifeline. She was one of the few people at the hospital who knew the full story and didn't judge Sarah for it. "How's Emma doing?" asked, glancing over at the child in the corner who had now switched to the red crayon, adding more violent slashes to her picture. Sarah sighed deeply. "Same. Silent. The therapist says it's progress that she colored the whole picture today instead of tearing up the paper like last week. But I just want to hear her laugh again. I want to hear her say, 'Mommy,' without me having to wait and wonder if it will happen or if the trauma has permanently stolen her voice." Placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You're doing everything right. She has a mother who loves her and fights for her every single day. That matters more than you know." But as Sarah looked back at her daughter, at those small hands gripping the crayon with desperate intensity, she wondered if love and effort would be enough. She wondered if Emma's voice was truly locked away, and if so, whether anyone held the key to unlocking it. The night pressed on, fluorescent and endless, and Emma remained silent in the corner, her drawing screaming what her voice could not. The knock came at 6:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning, jolting Sarah awake from a fitful sleep. She had only been home for 90 minutes after her night shift, and her body was still running on the fumes of cold coffee and adrenaline. Emma was asleep beside her, as she had been every night for the past 18 months. The child refused to sleep in her own bed, and Sarah didn't have the heart to force the issue. Her daughter needed the physical reassurance of her mother's presence, and truthfully, Sarah needed it too. They had become each other's lifeline. The knock sounded again, more insistent this time. Sarah's heart jumped into her throat. Early morning visits from strangers never meant anything good. She gently slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Emma, and padded to the door in her bare feet. Through the peephole, she saw a man in a detective's badge and a woman in a gray blazer, her official demeanor evident even through the distorted lens. Sarah's hands were shaking as she opened the door. "Detective?" she asked, recognizing him from previous interviews about abuse. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell. May we come in?" His voice was professional but not unkind. The woman beside him introduced herself as Assistant District Attorney. Sarah's mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, each worse than the last. Had been arrested? Was there more evidence? Had something happened to him that could complicate the custody case? She gestured them inside, suddenly acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. The hospital scrub still draped over yesterday's chair, the mess of toys scattered across the living room floor, the general chaos of a single mother's life. The detectives didn't seem to notice or care. They settled at her small kitchen table with the solemnity of people bearing significant news. "We have new information regarding your ex-partner," Ada began, sliding a manila folder across the table. Inside were photographs of bruises, on Emma's arm, on her shoulder, on her tiny captured during a medical examination. Sarah had seen these images before, but seeing them again made her stomach turn violently. "Additionally, we've been investigating his background, and we've discovered that he has a history of aggressive behavior that predates his relationship with you." Detective leaned forward. What this means, Ms. Mitchell, is that we have a much stronger case than we initially anticipated. However, there's one critical element that could seal this case permanently: Emma's testimony. Sarah felt her throat tighten. But she won't speak, you know that, the psychologist says. We're aware of her selective mutism, Ada interrupted gently. However, we believe that in a controlled environment with proper support, she may be able to provide testimony that would corroborate the physical evidence. A 3-year-old's word, combined with medical evidence and expert testimony, would be nearly impossible for the defense to overcome. She's 3 years old, Sarah said, her voice rising slightly with panic. She can barely string together sentences even with me. How can you expect her to testify in a courtroom? That will traumatize her further. We understand your concerns, Detective said, his tone sympathetic. But consider the alternative. Without her testimony, the defense will argue that the bruises could have been accidental, that you might be coaching the medical evidence to support a false narrative. Yes, we'll likely win anyway, but conviction without her voice gives ammunition for appeal. With her testimony, this case becomes airtight. The two officers spent the next hour explaining the legal process, the timeline, and what they would need from Sarah. A court date had been set for 6 weeks away. Emma would need to be examined more thoroughly by a child psychologist to determine if she was capable of testifying. If deemed competent by the court, she would be called to sit in front of a judge, the defense attorney, the prosecutor, and potentially a jury. Sarah's hands trembled as she listened. After the detectives left, Sarah sat at her kitchen table for 3 hours without moving. She called in sick to the hospital, unable to face the fluorescent lights and beeping machines. Instead, she sat with her own demons, the guilt, the fear, the impossible choices. At 9 a.m., Emma woke and padded into the kitchen, climbing into Sarah's lap without speaking, sensing her mother's distress. Sarah held her daughter and wept quietly into her hair. That afternoon, Sarah called Doctor and explained the situation. The psychologist was quiet for a long moment before responding. "This is delicate territory," Doctor said carefully. "We're essentially asking Emma to relive trauma in front of strangers in an intimidating environment. That could set her recovery back significantly, or it could be the catalyst that breaks through her selective mutism. There's no way to predict which outcome we'll get." "What do you recommend?" Sarah asked desperately. "We continue our current therapy approach while also preparing her psychologically for the possibility of testifying. We don't pressure her, we don't coach her, and we let her know that whatever happens, she's safe. But Ms. Mitchell, I want to be honest with you. This is going to be difficult, for both of you." Over the following weeks, Sarah existed in a state of anxious limbo. She attended sessions with Doctor, learning how to talk to Emma about the court process without traumatizing her further. She read parenting books about helping traumatized children. She consulted with the prosecutor about logistics and preparation. Meanwhile, Emma remained mostly silent, though Sarah began to notice subtle changes. The child seemed more anxious, as if she could somehow sense the approaching storm. 2 weeks before the trial, Sarah received a phone call that made her blood run cold. Judge's office was confirming Emma's court appearance. The judge was known throughout the district as fair but unyielding, a woman who ran her courtroom with precision, and who did not tolerate disruption or emotional appeals. Reading her background, Sarah learned that Judge had a reputation for being especially harsh on cases involving child abuse. This was meant to be reassuring, but it somehow made everything feel more real, more terrifying, more consequential. Sarah began having nightmares. In them, Emma would break down on the witness stand, would refuse to speak entirely, would regress so severely that she would return to pre-verbal development. Sarah imagined Smug Face as the case fell apart, imagined him being released on a technicality, imagined him someday regaining custody. These nightmares woke her at 3 and 4 a.m., her heart racing, her sheets soaked with sweat. The night before the trial, Sarah held Emma close, both of them unable to sleep. She whispered promises into her daughter's hair. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I love you. You're safe. You're so brave. Whether you say one word or 100 words or no words at all, I'm proud of you." Emma didn't respond. She never did. But she nestled deeper into her mother's embrace, and that had to be enough. It had to be. Because tomorrow everything would change. The morning of the trial arrived with the kind of gray, oppressive weather that seemed to mock the gravity of the day. Sarah had woken at 4 a.m., unable to sleep despite being exhausted beyond measure. She lay in the darkness beside Emma, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall, memorizing the peaceful expression on the child's face. By 9 a.m., they would be in a courtroom. By this time tomorrow, everything could be different. Sarah chose Emma's outfit with the care of someone preparing a soldier for battle. She selected a pale pink dress that Emma had once loved, back when she still laughed and played without fear. White tights, tiny black shoes that Sarah had bought 3 months ago, optimistically believing they would be before the trial date. She dressed herself in a navy suit she'd borrowed from a professional but not intimidating, she hoped. She wanted to look credible but not cold, concerned but not hysterical. The stakes of appearance had never felt higher. The courthouse itself was an imposing structure of gray stone and marble, the kind of building designed to make people feel small and insignificant. Sarah held Emma's hand as they climbed the steps, the child's palm clammy and small in her own. Emma wore an expression of profound confusion. She didn't understand why they were here, didn't understand what was about to happen. Sarah had tried to explain in simple terms that they were going to talk to some people about staying safe, but the words felt inadequate and misleading. Inside, the courthouse was a maze of hallways, security checkpoints, and echoing voices. Sarah's heels clicked against the polished floor, a sound that made Emma flinch slightly. The child stayed close, her small form pressed against Sarah's leg as they navigated through crowds of lawyers in dark suits, witnesses looking terrified, and court officers who moved with practiced efficiency through the chaos. Ada had instructed them to arrive early, to get Emma acclimated to the environment before the proceedings began. The waiting area outside the courtroom was sterile and unwelcoming. Uncomfortable chairs, fluorescent lighting that seemed designed to increase anxiety, and the distant sound of a judge's gavel from another courtroom down the hall. Sarah sat with Emma on her lap, reading picture books in a voice that sounded hollow even to her own ears. Emma didn't respond to the stories, didn't point at the illustrations or ask questions. She simply sat, small and silent, her fingers twisted together in her lap. It was around 9:15 a.m. when Sarah first saw him. Officer David emerged from a side corridor, and at first, Sarah barely registered his presence. He was just another person in uniform moving through the courthouse. But then she noticed what accompanied him, and her breath caught in her throat. The dog was enormous, a German shepherd with a rich tan and black coat, alert ears, and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything. The animal walked with a deliberate, measured pace beside the officer, not pulling on the leash, not lunging or barking. There was a calm competence about the dog that immediately commanded attention. Sarah's first instinct was protective anxiety. Would such a large animal frighten Emma further? But she didn't have time to fully process the thought before Officer noticed her. "Excuse me, ma'am." His voice was warm, his expression friendly. He approached with the dog, moving slowly enough that he wasn't threatening. "Are you Sarah Mitchell?" Sarah nodded, confused. "Yes, but—" "I'm Officer David from the K-9 unit. This is Bella." He gestured to the dog with genuine affection. "Ada called me last week. She mentioned your daughter's situation and asked if I might be able to help provide some comfort during the proceedings." Sarah's mind struggled to process this. She had heard nothing about this from the prosecutor. Before she could respond, Officer was already kneeling down to Emma's level, his movements slow and non-threatening. "Hey there, Emma. I'm Officer, and this is my best friend in the whole world, Bella. Bella is what we call a trauma response dog. Do you know what that means?" Emma stared at him, her expression unreadable. "It means Bella has been specially trained to help people who are going through scary things feel a little bit braver. She doesn't talk, kind of like you, I'm guessing. But she's really, really good at listening. Would you like to say hello to her?" Sarah watched, her heart in her throat, as Officer gently guided Bella closer. The dog, sensing something fragile in the small child before her, moved with exquisite gentleness. Bella lowered her head, allowing Emma to see her face at eye level. The dog's tail wagged slowly, a careful, controlled movement rather than the exuberant tail thrashing of a typical dog. For a long moment, nothing happened. Emma simply stared at Bella, and Bella stared back at Emma, and Sarah held her breath, unsure what would happen next. Then, almost imperceptibly, Emma's lips curved upward. Not a smile exactly. It had been too long since Sarah had seen a genuine smile on her daughter's face, but something in that direction. An acknowledgement, an opening. "Would you like to touch her?" Officer asked gently. "Bella loves being petted. Her fur is really soft." Sarah expected Emma to shake her head or pull away. Instead, the child's small hand reached out slowly, tentatively, and made contact with Bella's head. The moment her fingers touched the dog's fur, Emma's entire body seemed to relax slightly. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing deepened. It was as if the simple act of touching the dog had somehow signaled safety to some ancient, primal part of her brain. Officer sat back on his heels, giving Emma space but remaining present. "Bella is going to be here today with us in the courtroom. If you feel scared or worried, you can look at Bella and remember that she's here too. And she's very brave. So that means you're brave too." Sarah felt moisture prickling at the corners of her eyes. She had become so numb over these past 18 months that she thought she might have forgotten how to cry for anything other than despair. But this unexpected kindness, this stranger who had somehow anticipated exactly what her daughter might need, broke through some of her armor. Over the next 30 minutes, Officer and Bella remained with them. He explained that Bella would stay with Emma throughout the proceedings, that the dog was trained to alert to signs of extreme distress, that the court had already approved this arrangement. He taught Emma how to gently pet Bella, how to listen to the dog's heartbeat by placing her hand on the animal's chest. He talked quietly about how brave dogs are, how they protect people, how they never judge or get angry. By the time Ada appeared to usher them into the courtroom, something had shifted in the air. Emma still hadn't spoken, not one word, but her grip on Sarah's hand had loosened slightly. She kept one hand on Bella's head, and the dog stayed close, never leaving the child's side. As they stood to enter the courtroom, Officer placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "She's going to be okay," he said quietly, "and so are you." Sarah nodded, unable to speak, watching as her silent daughter walked into the courtroom holding the hand of a police officer and touching the soft head of a dog named Bella. Whatever happened next, something had already changed. The courtroom was colder than Sarah had expected. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere, all dark wood paneling, high ceilings, and the weight of institutional authority pressing down from every angle. The judge's bench loomed above like a throne, and the jury box sat empty for now. They would fill it once the proceedings officially began. The gallery behind them was already beginning to fill with observers, journalists, and court watchers. Sarah's ex-boyfriend's family occupied 3 rows of seats, their expressions ranging from angry to vindictive. They believed was innocent, believed Sarah was lying, believed the bruises on Emma's body could be explained away. The sight of them made Sarah's stomach roil. Officer had positioned himself strategically near where Emma would sit. Bella lay on a special mat beside him, her demeanor calm and professional in a way that suggested she had done this countless times before. The court had made exceptions for her presence. Normally, dogs were not permitted in courtrooms, but the judge had approved Bella as an accommodation for a traumatized child witness. Sarah had read the formal paperwork explaining Bella's certification and training, understanding that Officer had fought for this opportunity. Ada approached them, her expression serious but determined. "We're going to start in about 5 minutes. I wanted to prepare you for what's going to happen. The defense will likely try to establish that Emma is not a reliable witness. They'll question her about her memory, her ability to distinguish between reality and imagination, whether she's been coached. Don't react to their questions, no matter how infuriating they are. Emma is allowed to have Officer and Bella nearby, but Sarah, you'll be seated in the gallery. You won't be able to be at her side. Sarah felt panic rise in her chest. Separation from Emma, even for the duration of testimony, felt impossible, but she understood. This was the price of justice, the cost of protection. Emma sat between Officer and Bella, swinging her legs slightly since her feet didn't touch the ground. The child was dressed in that pale pink dress, looking impossibly small and vulnerable in the enormous courtroom. Her hand rested on Bella's head, fingers occasionally stroking the dog's soft fur. It was clear that the dog was providing some kind of grounding mechanism, some tactile reassurance that Emma's overwhelmed nervous system desperately needed. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge entered, her robes flowing behind her, her expression stern and businesslike. She was a woman in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She settled into her seat and reviewed the proceedings with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. We're here regarding the custody termination and abuse allegations case of the state versus, the judge announced. I understand we have a minor witness present. Ada stood. Yes, Your Honor. Emma Mitchell, age 3, will be providing testimony regarding incidents she witnessed. Sat at the defense table, his expression smug and unconcerned. He was handsome in a conventional way, with dark hair and sharp features. He smiled at the judge as if they were old friends. Sarah felt her hands clench into fists. How could he sit there like that? How could he show no remorse, no understanding of the devastation he had caused? The judge looked directly at Emma, her expression softening fractionally. Hello, Emma. My name is Judge. I'm the person who makes important decisions about your safety. Is it okay if I ask you some questions today? Emma didn't respond, didn't nod or shake her head. Her hand gripped Bella's fur more tightly. I see you have a friend with you, the judge continued, glancing at Officer and Bella. That's Officer and Bella. They're going to stay right here with you the whole time, okay? If you ever feel scared or upset, you just let me know. The prosecutor approached, speaking in measured, gentle tones designed not to startle the child. Emma, do you know what it means to tell the truth? Silence. Emma stared ahead, her expression carefully blank. Emma, can you tell me about a time when your daddy was very loud? More silence. Sarah held her breath from her seat in the gallery, her eyes never leaving her daughter. The defense attorney smirked. He was already building his narrative. The child couldn't be trusted as a witness. She was too traumatized to communicate. She was unreliable. Then Officer did something subtle but crucial. He shifted slightly and gently squeezed Bella's collar, a signal the dog had been trained to recognize. Bella pressed her entire body against Emma's leg, providing deep pressure stimulation that is known to calm anxious nervous systems. The dog's weight against the child's leg seemed to ground her. The prosecutor continued with patient questioning, asking about loud voices, about scary nights, about places where Emma felt safe and unsafe. Emma remained silent, but her free hand had wrapped around Bella's neck in an embrace. Then the prosecutor asked, Emma, do you feel safe right now? There was a pause that stretched across the courtroom like a held breath. Everyone seemed frozen, waiting. And then, in a voice so small and fragile it seemed to come from very far away, Emma whispered, Help me. The courtroom erupted into a shocked silence so profound it was almost deafening. Those two words, barely audible, carrying the weight of 18 months of trauma and suffering, seemed to reverberate through every surface. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, and a sound escaped her, something between a gasp and a sob. Officer's eyes flooded with tears. The bailiff turned away, his shoulders shaking. The court stenographer, a woman who must have recorded thousands of testimonies in her career, placed her hand over her heart. Judge's stern expression cracked visibly. She set down her pen and simply stared at Emma, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Bella's tail wagged slowly, gently, as if the dog understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. Emma had spoken. After 18 months of silence, after trauma and fear and the complete shutdown of her ability to communicate verbally, Emma had found her voice. The prosecutor turned away, unable to continue for a moment. When she returned to her questioning, her voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you for being so brave, Emma. Can you tell me more about what happened?" And in that small, whispered voice, Emma began to speak. Her words came haltingly, sometimes confused, sometimes frighteningly clear. She described the night her father had gotten angry. She talked about his loud voice, his raised hands, his grabbing. She spoke of being scared, of hiding, of pain. It was exactly the kind of disjointed, emotionally raw testimony that experts know is the hallmark of truth from a traumatized child, too confused to be coached, too honest to be fabricated. The defense attorney attempted his cross-examination, trying to undermine Emma's statements, suggesting she had been influenced or coerced. But every time his questions became too aggressive, Bella would sense Emma's rising anxiety and provide comfort. The dog had essentially become part of the proceedings, a legal accommodation that was simultaneously an act of profound compassion. By the time Emma's testimony concluded, the courtroom was forever changed. A 3-year-old girl had broken 18 months of silence with 2 words. Those words had traveled from her traumatized brain to her lips to the ears of 12 jurors, and in doing so, they had begun to heal her, even as they condemned the man who had wounded her so deeply. Sarah rushed to Emma as soon as she was excused from the witness stand, pulling her daughter into her arms and holding her as though she might dissolve into nothing. Emma buried her face in her mother's neck, and though she didn't speak, her embrace communicated everything that words could not. "I am still here. I survived. I am healing." The courthouse hallway seemed to buzz with electric energy after Emma's testimony concluded. Word had spread through the building like wildfire. The silent child had spoken, had given testimony that pierced through the veil of legal procedure to reach something raw and human in everyone who had witnessed it. Sarah stood with Emma in the hallway outside the courtroom, the child still holding Bella's leash, still refusing to let go of the dog's presence even though the formal testimony had ended. Other court officers, lawyers, and staff members who had nothing to do with the case seemed to find reasons to walk past them, their eyes lingering on the small girl who had just performed an act of extraordinary courage. Ada emerged from the courtroom, her expression energized in a way it hadn't been before. She immediately sought out Sarah, her eyes still red from the tears she had shed during Emma's testimony. "That was extraordinary," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been prosecuting for 15 years, and I have never witnessed anything like that. The jury is going to remember those 2 words for the rest of their lives." But it was what said next that shifted everything. "We need to talk strategy," she continued, pulling Sarah and Officer into a small conference room off the main hallway. Once the door was closed, she explained the situation with the intensity of someone who had just realized she was holding a winning hand. "Emma's testimony is going to be critical, but here's the problem. The defense will argue that a 3-year-old's account is unreliable, that she was coached, that she doesn't understand causation or consequence. However, if we can present her testimony in a way that demonstrates her emotional authenticity and her genuine distress, we can overcome those arguments." Officer leaned forward. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I want Emma to testify again," said bluntly. "Not the entire testimony, just key moments, with Bella present in the same format. The jury needs to see that consistency, that emotional truth. The judge has already allowed the accommodation. The defense can't object without looking heartless on the record." Sarah felt her stomach clench. She's 3 years old. She's already once. Are we really going to put her through this again? "I know what I'm asking," said, meeting Sarah's eyes directly. "But consider what we're fighting for. If we convict decisively with no room for appeal, Emma gets permanence. She gets safety. She gets to begin healing knowing that he cannot come back. If we let this case remain uncertain, if the jury comes back with a weak conviction or if the defense successfully appeals, Emma lives in fear. She wakes up every day wondering if her father might find her again. Sarah looked at her daughter, who sat quietly petting Bella's head with a gentleness that broke her heart. Emma had already shown more courage than most adults could muster. The question was whether her mother had the courage to ask for more. "Okay," Sarah said quietly, "we'll do it." What followed was a crash course in courtroom testimony preparation. Over the next 3 hours, Ada and Officer worked together to help Emma understand what was going to happen. They used simple language, positive framing, and constant reassurance. Officer explained that Bella would be with her every step, described the courtroom not as a scary place, but as a place where people listened, where important decisions were made, where Emma had the power to help herself. "You have something inside you that is very special," Officer told Emma, kneeling down to her level. "You have the truth, and when you tell the truth, even when it's scary, you help people. You help yourself the most." Emma didn't respond verbally, but she leaned against Officer, and the police officer held her with the tenderness of someone who understood trauma intimately. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The breakthrough testimony of the previous day had attracted journalists, victim advocates, and interested observers. Judge reviewed the proceedings and allowed to present Emma's testimony again, with the understanding that this would be the child's last formal testimony. Sarah sat in the gallery, her hands clasped so tightly her nails dug into her palms. This time, Emma walked into the courtroom with visible confidence. Bella stayed at her side. An officer positioned himself within her sight line. The prosecutor took her through the event step by step, asking careful, open-ended questions that allowed Emma to describe what she had seen and felt in her own words. "Can you tell me about the night that was scary?" asked gently. Emma's voice was still small, still hesitant, but it was there, present, real, undeniable. "Daddy was loud, very loud he was. He was angry at Mommy, but Mommy wasn't there. I was there." "What happened when Daddy was loud and angry?" He grabbed me. His hand was big and my arm is small. It hurt. I cried, but I tried to be quiet because loud makes it worse." The jury sat transfixed. Several jurors had tears streaming down their faces. Judge listened with an expression of profound concentration, occasionally making notes, but mostly just taking in the reality of what this small child was reporting. Emma continued, describing the apartment, the furniture, the way she had hidden in the corner. Her descriptions were specific enough to be credible but confused enough to be authentic. A coached child would have a more coherent narrative. Emma's account was fragmented, emotional, real. When the defense attorney cross-examined her, he attempted the same strategy he'd used before, trying to suggest that Emma was confused or had been influenced. But this time, Emma didn't retreat. This time, she had found something inside herself that was stronger than her fear. "Did Mommy tell you to say that your daddy was loud?" the defense attorney asked, his tone suggesting that Sarah had coached her daughter. "No," Emma said clearly. "He was loud, I remember. I still hear loud voices and it makes me scared." "But you don't remember what he said when he was loud, do you?" "No," Emma admitted, "but I remember the feeling, the scared feeling, the hurt." It was devastating testimony because it was true. A real child's memory, specific in some ways, vague in others, but emotionally consistent and authentic. When Emma was finally excused from the witness stand, she was visibly exhausted but also visibly changed. She had spoken her truth twice, and in doing so, she had claimed something precious. Her own agency, her own power, her own voice. That afternoon, during a recess, Judge requested to see Emma in her chambers. Sarah's heart began to race. Was there a problem? Had something gone wrong? But when they arrived, the judge was sitting on the edge of her desk in a much less formal posture than she maintained from the bench. "Emma, I wanted to tell you something," Judge began, her stern demeanor completely softened. "You are one of the bravest people I have ever met in this courtroom. Not because you're 3 years old, although that makes it even more remarkable, but because you chose to tell the truth even when it was scary. Do you know what happens when people tell the truth in court?" Emma shook her head slightly. "Justice happens," the judge said simply, "and that's something very important. You should be incredibly proud of yourself." Sarah watched her daughter, seeing something shift in the child's posture, in the way she held her small shoulders just a little bit. Emma had found her voice, and in finding it, she had begun to find herself. The remaining testimony in the trial proceeded with a rhythmic intensity, each witness building upon the foundation that Emma's courage had established. The prosecution presented their case methodically. Medical experts about the bruises, their consistency with non-accidental trauma, their placement on a body far too small to have obtained them through normal childhood accidents. A pediatric radiologist discussed the evidence visible on Emma's skeletal survey, healing fractures at different stages, indicating repeated trauma over time. A social worker detailed the home environment had maintained before Sarah had taken custody, describing filth, inadequate provisions, and signs of neglect. Each piece of evidence seemed to hang in the courtroom air like a condemnation. The jury listened intently, their faces reflecting a dawning horror at the systematic nature of the abuse. Several jurors glanced occasionally at Emma, who sat with her mother in the gallery now that her testimony was complete. The child held a stuffed rabbit that officer had given her, and Bella remained nearby, her presence a quiet statement of support. Then came testimony. Sarah felt her entire body tense as her ex-boyfriend took the stand. He wore a suit that must have cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. His family had money, had hired an expensive defense attorney. He swore to tell the truth with an expression of injured innocence that made Sarah want to scream. "Mr. his attorney began, "did you intentionally harm your daughter, Emma?" "Absolutely not," said firmly. "I love my daughter. These allegations are completely false. I was a good father." "How do you explain the bruises?" "Emma is an active toddler. She falls frequently. She bumps into furniture. Kids her age bruise easily. I think Sarah is trying to alienate me from my daughter because she's jealous, because she wants to punish me for moving on after our breakup." Sarah's hands clenched. The lies were so smooth, so carefully constructed. She understood suddenly why abusers were often effective at their deception. They had practiced it so long, refined it so carefully, that the falsehoods rolled off their tongues as naturally as truth. But then Ada stood for cross-examination, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. "Mister, you stated that Emma is an active toddler who falls frequently. Yet according to her records, there were no incident reports of significant falls during the months she was in your care. Can you explain that discrepancy?" His composure flickered slightly. "She may not have reported minor falls to the—" "Minor falls don't typically result in spiral fractures, mister. Minor falls don't result in bruising patterns consistent with hand prints. Can you explain the medical evidence of repeated trauma at different healing stages?" "I can't. I don't know how that happened." "You don't know how your daughter acquired bruises in the shape of adult hand prints?" "I didn't do it." "But you were her primary caregiver during that period, correct?" "Yes, but—" "And no one else had access to her during your custody time?" "No, I mean yes, just me, but I didn't hurt her." Proceeded to systematically dismantle every claim, every excuse, every attempt at plausible deniability. She presented phone records showing had called Sarah repeatedly demanding money. She presented testimony from his ex-girlfriend, a woman he dated before Sarah, who described a pattern of violent outbursts, controlling behavior, and substance abuse issues. She presented a psychiatric evaluation, indicating personality disorder traits consistent with perpetrators of intimate partner violence and child abuse. By the time finished, carefully constructed facade had crumbled. He sat in the witness box looking deflated, his expensive suit suddenly making him look pathetic rather than authoritative. The closing arguments began on the afternoon of the third day. The prosecution went first, and Ada's words seemed to reach into the jury box and grab each juror by the heart. "This case is about a father who hurt his daughter," she began simply. "Not accidentally, not through carelessness, but systematically, repeatedly, violently. We know this because the evidence tells us. Medical evidence, photographic evidence, testimony from professionals who have dedicated their careers to understanding child trauma." She paused, letting the weight of these statements settle. "But most importantly, we know this because Emma told us. A 3-year-old girl, traumatized to the point of silence, found her voice in this courtroom. She described what happened with the emotional authenticity that only truth possesses. She didn't use adult language. She didn't describe events with perfect coherence. She told us what a 3-year-old experiencing abuse would tell us: fragmented, frightening, real." Walked toward the jury box, her expression intense. "The defense wants you to believe that Emma was coached, that her testimony is unreliable, that we should discount it in favor of the defendant's smooth lies. But I ask you, why would a mother coach her daughter to undergo this trauma? Why would a prosecution risk their case on the testimony of a 3-year-old unless it was absolutely necessary? Because the truth is that important. Because protection of this child is that important. Because justice demands that we listen when a little girl finds the courage to speak her truth." The defense attorney's closing was defensive and convoluted, full of attacks on Sarah's credibility, suggestions of ulterior motives, implications that the medical evidence could be misinterpreted. But his arguments fell flat against the weight of what the jury had heard and seen. They had watched a traumatized child break 18 months of silence. They had heard her describe her own abuse. They had listened to expert after expert confirm that her account was consistent with the physical evidence and with how traumatized children typically present. The judge gave his instructions to the jury, and they filed out to deliberate. Sarah sat in the hallway with Emma on her lap, Officer beside them, Bella resting her head against Sarah's leg. They waited in a state of suspended animation, unable to do anything but hope and pray that justice would prevail. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, the bailiff called them back into the courtroom. The jury filed in with expressions of grim determination. The foreman stood. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts. Count 1, child abuse. Count 2, felony assault. Count 3, endangerment of a minor." The courtroom erupted. Sarah felt something break open inside her chest, not breaking in the sense of breaking apart, but breaking open in the sense of finally releasing all the pressure and pain that had been building for 18 months. She buried her face in Emma's hair and wept, the kind of tears that come from the depths of the soul. Emma, not understanding the legal implications but sensing the shift in energy, squeezed her mother's neck. "Mommy." "It's okay, baby," Sarah whispered through her tears. "It's okay now, you're safe, you did it, you're safe." Officer placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, and Bella pressed her entire body against them both, as if the dog understood that this moment was sacred, that this moment was the moment when a child could finally begin to heal. Judge looked directly at with an expression of absolute contempt. "Mister, you will face sentencing in 4 weeks. In the interim, you will have no contact with the minor child. Your parental rights are suspended pending termination proceedings. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court certainly will not." His face went white. His expensive attorney leaned over, whispering urgently, but there was nothing left to say. The jury had spoken. Justice had prevailed, and a little girl's courage had changed everything. The verdict reverberated through the courthouse like a thunderclap, and in its aftermath there was a strange, suspended moment of disbelief. Sat at the defense table with his attorney, his face the color of old concrete. His family members in the gallery had already begun packing their belongings, their expensive purses snapping shut with finality. The judge had withdrawn to his chambers. The jury was being excused. But Sarah sat frozen in the gallery, Emma against her chest, unable to fully process that this nightmare might finally be over. Judge's bailiff approached Sarah quietly. "The judge would like to see you in her chambers. Just you, Ms. Mitchell, and Emma. Officer is welcome as well if the child wishes him present." Sarah looked at Officer, who nodded reassuringly. "Come on," he said gently, gesturing for them to follow. Bella walked alongside them, her presence somehow making the intimidating courthouse feel less threatening. Judge's chambers were nothing like the formal courtroom. The walls were lined with books, legal volumes certainly, but also philosophy, history, poetry. Family photographs occupied one corner of her desk. A younger judge with a man who was presumably her late husband, children at various ages, smiling at birthday parties. It humanized her in a way that the judicial robe never could. The judge was sitting on the edge of her desk rather than behind it, a deliberate choice to lower herself closer to Emma's eye level. She had removed her judicial robe, revealing a woman of substance beneath the formal trappings of the law. Her eyes were red from crying, though she had clearly attempted to compose herself. "Emma," Judge began, her voice uncharacteristically soft, "I want to tell you something very important. Will you listen?" Emma nodded slightly, her small hand still gripping Sarah's shirt. "You are one of the bravest people I have ever met in my entire life," the judge said, and Sarah could hear the tremor in her voice. "Not because you're a big, strong adult, but because you are a little girl and you were very scared and you found the courage to tell the truth anyway. Do you understand what courage is?" Emma shook her head. "Courage is when you're scared but you do the right thing anyway. You were scared in that courtroom, I could see that. But you spoke your truth, and because you did that, something very important happened." The judge paused, seeming to gather herself. Sarah watched as this stern, authoritative woman struggled with her emotions. "Because of your courage, the person who hurt you will not be able to hurt you again. He will not be able to hurt anyone else. And you made that happen. You, a 3-year-old girl, changed the world. Your world, at least. And maybe other people's worlds too, because now people will know that even the smallest voice matters. Even a whisper can change everything." Tears began to roll down the judge's face, and she made no attempt to hide them. She turned to Sarah, and her expression was one of profound respect mixed with something that looked like maternal tenderness. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that in my 23 years on the bench, I have never witnessed a child demonstrate the kind of resilience and courage that Emma showed in this trial. You have raised a daughter who understands, even at such a young age, the difference between right and wrong. You have protected her, advocated for her, and created an environment where she could find her voice. That takes extraordinary strength. I wanted to acknowledge that." Sarah felt her throat constrict. She had spent 18 months believing she was failing, that she hadn't protected Emma enough, that she had somehow caused this trauma by choosing the wrong man, by trusting the wrong person. Hearing the judge validate her efforts broke something open inside her. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, unable to say more. Judge stood and walked to a small refrigerator hidden in her desk, an unusual addition to a judge's chambers. A small container of what appeared to be homemade cookies. "I baked these last night," she said, kneeling down to Emma's level and offering them to the child. "Chocolate chip, my favorite. I wanted to give them to the bravest girl I know." Emma looked at her mother for permission, and Sarah nodded. The child reached out with surprising confidence and took a cookie, then surprised everyone by offering it to Bella first, allowing the dog to sniff it before she took a bite herself. The gesture was so pure, so reflective of Emma's instinct to share even in her moment of triumph, that Judge's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Officer," the judge said, turning her attention to the police officer who had remained standing respectfully near the door, "I want you to know that your presence here, and Bella's presence, was instrumental in this outcome. I am going to be recommending to the State Judicial Council that we implement a formal program using trauma response dogs in all courtrooms dealing with child abuse cases. We cannot undo the trauma these children have experienced, but we can create environments where their truth can emerge more safely. You've shown us what's possible. Officer's own eyes grew moist. Thank you, Your Honor. That means everything. Bella and I believe that every child deserves to have their truth heard. Judge then did something that violated courtroom protocol entirely. She hugged both Sarah and Emma. It was brief, but it was profound. A judge, sworn to maintain distance and impartiality, broke her own rules to offer human comfort to a woman and child who desperately needed it. I'm going to make a note in the official case file, Judge continued, moving back to her desk and opening a thick folder. I'm documenting that the presence of the trauma response dog Bella was instrumental in the child witness's disclosure and testimony. This will be part of the permanent record. If there are any appeals, if any higher court reviews this case, they will see that we created the conditions for a traumatized child to speak her truth safely, and they will see that it worked. She looked directly at Sarah. The parental rights termination will proceed quickly. This verdict essentially guarantees that we'll have no legal relationship to Emma ever again. You are her mother, you are her protector, and the law now stands completely behind that. Sarah nodded, unable to speak through her tears. As they prepared to leave, Judge called out one more time. Emma, one more thing, I want you to remember something. In this world there are people who hurt others, but there are also people who help others. People like your mother, people like Officer, people like Bella. You get to choose as you grow up which kind of person you want to be. I hope you choose to be a helper. I have a feeling you will. Emma looked up at the judge, and for the first time since the ordeal began, a genuine smile bloomed across the child's face. Not a big smile, not an exuberant expression of joy, but a real smile that reflected genuine feeling. Walking out of Judge's chambers, Sarah felt something fundamental shift within her. The weight hadn't completely lifted, healing would be a long process, but for the first time she believed that healing was actually possible. Emma had found her voice. Justice had prevailed. And in the most unlikely place, a courthouse, a place of judgment and adversity, they had encountered profound grace. Officer walked beside them as they made their way through the courthouse. You did good today, both of you, he said quietly. Really good. This is going to mean something for so many other kids. As they emerged into the afternoon sunlight outside the courthouse steps, Emma reached up and took Sarah's hand with one hand and Bella's collar with the other. Three beings, a mother, a child, and a dog, standing together on the precipice of a new beginning. 6 months later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the park as Emma ran through the grass, her laughter, that precious, long-absent sound, ringing out across the open space. Sarah sat on a bench nearby, watching her daughter play with a group of children she had met at preschool. This version of Emma seemed almost like a different child, not because the trauma had completely disappeared, but because she had learned to live alongside it, to let it inform her without defining her. The transformation hadn't been linear. There had been difficult nights in the early weeks after the trial, nightmares that jolted Emma awake in a state of panic. There had been regression, days when Emma went silent again, when loud noises sent her back to that place of fear and hypervigilance. But there had also been breakthrough moments, small victories that accumulated into a new normal. Emma had started preschool 3 months after the trial concluded. On her first day, she had clung to Sarah's leg with white-knuckled intensity. But her new teacher, a woman named Ms. with infinite patience and gentle wisdom, had spent weeks building trust with the child. She never forced Emma to participate in group activities. She never demanded that she speak. She simply created a safe space where Emma could emerge at her own pace. The turning point had come unexpectedly. During a music circle one morning, Ms. had been singing a simple children's song. Emma had begun humming along, just quietly at first, barely audible but unmistakably present. By the second verse, Emma was actually singing, her small voice joining the chorus of other children's voices. Ms. had caught Sarah's eye that afternoon during pickup, and they had both cried, the teacher understanding the significance of that moment in ways that most people couldn't. Now, as Sarah watched her daughter play, she realized that Emma was engaging in the normal chaos of childhood, negotiating who would be it in a game of tag, offering to share a snack, laughing at jokes that probably didn't make much sense. There were still moments when Emma's trauma surfaced. Certain loud noises could startle her, and she remained cautious with unfamiliar adults, but these moments were becoming the exception rather than the rule. Officer and Bella had become regular fixtures in their lives. Every month, the police officer visited the hospital where Sarah still worked, but now the visits were different. Instead of bringing professional support during a crisis, Officer came to say hello to his friend. Emma would run to greet them, and the reunion was always joyful, always filled with genuine connection. Bella had become Emma's comfort animal in the truest sense, not because the law required it, but because the bond between child and dog had transcended the courtroom and become something real and lasting. Sarah had learned that Bella had been born from a rescue background herself. Officer had rescued the German Shepherd from a shelter where she had been deemed too anxious to work as a police dog, but rather than giving up on the animal, had enrolled her in a specialized trauma response training program. Bella had transformed from a frightened, reactive dog into an intuitive, healing presence. Sarah often thought about the parallel journeys, Emma and Bella, both traumatized, both finding their way to wholeness through love and support. The story of Emma and Bella had captured national attention. A local news station had run a feature about the case, focusing on the breakthrough moment in the courtroom. The segment had gone viral on social media, reaching millions of people. In the aftermath, Sarah received messages from parents across the country, sharing their own stories of children who had survived trauma, seeking advice, seeking hope, seeking confirmation that healing was possible. Judge had followed through on her promise to implement systemic change. She had proposed the Emma's Voice initiative, a statewide program to place trauma response dogs in courtrooms dealing with child abuse cases. The proposal had moved through the Judicial Council with remarkable speed, buoyed by the evidence of Emma's case and by the political will that public attention had generated. Within 6 months, 3 additional courthouses in the state had implemented the program. Within a year, the initiative had caught the attention of judges and child advocates in neighboring states. Sarah had been invited to speak at a judicial conference, sharing Emma's story with judges, prosecutors, and victim advocates from across the region. She had been terrified. Public speaking was not her strength, but she had done it for Emma, had channeled her daughter's courage into her own words. Standing in front of hundreds of legal professionals, telling them about the 2 words that had changed everything, Sarah had felt a sense of purpose that transcended her own pain. Emma's therapist, doctor, had noted in her recent evaluation that Emma's symptoms of selective mutism had essentially resolved. The child now spoke regularly, participated in class discussions, and interacted with peers in age-appropriate ways. While doctor cautioned that trauma healing was never truly complete, she expressed genuine optimism about Emma's trajectory. "Your daughter is resilient," doctor had told Sarah. Not despite her trauma, but perhaps partially because of how it was handled. She learned that she could be heard. That matters. On Emma's 4th birthday, Sarah had thrown a small party in their apartment. Officer and Bella had attended, along with Ms. Doctor and a handful of Emma's preschool friends. The cake was decorated with a picture of a German Shepherd, Bella's image, because Emma had insisted. The birthday girl had blown out her candles and made a wish that she wouldn't reveal, but that made her smile mysteriously. Later, when the other guests had left and Emma was asleep, Sarah sat alone on her couch and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had transpired. She thought about the woman she had been 18 months ago, exhausted, terrified, wondering if her daughter would ever recover. She thought about that moment in the courthouse when Emma had whispered, "Help me," and how those two words had set so many things in motion. The settlement from the case had provided enough financial cushion that Sarah had reduced her hours at the hospital to part-time. She was considering going back to school to become a child advocate, to formalize the work she wanted to do supporting traumatized children and their families. Officer had mentioned that the K-9 unit was always looking for advocates to help place dogs with children in need, and Sarah had begun exploring that possibility as well. Was currently serving his sentence in the state penitentiary. Sarah rarely thought about him anymore. He had become irrelevant to her life in a way that seemed impossible during those dark months of legal proceedings. What mattered now was not his punishment, but Emma's healing. One evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed, the child had asked a question that still echoed in Sarah's mind. "Mommy, did my words really change things?" "Yes, baby," Sarah had answered, brushing the hair back from her daughter's forehead. "Your words changed everything. Your courage helped other people understand that even small voices matter, that big things can start with brave little whispers." Emma had smiled and closed her eyes, and Sarah had sat with her until she fell asleep, thinking about the journey from silence to voice, from victimization to agency, from despair to hope. The courtroom had been the crucible where transformation had occurred. But the real healing was happening here, in the quiet moments of a mother and daughter rebuilding their lives, in the friendship between a traumatized girl and a trained dog, in the systemic changes being implemented, because one child found the courage to speak. Emma's story wasn't over. Healing would continue in small ways and large for years to come. But she had already accomplished something remarkable. She had broken her silence, reclaimed her voice, and in doing so, had begun to heal not just herself, but countless others who would benefit from the changes her courage had set in motion. She was 4 years old and she had changed the world.